The Equal Rights Amendment.
The ERA.
Equal Rights Amendment.
The Equal Rights Amendment.
The Equal Rights Amendment.
The Equal Rights Amendment.
Remember the women.
And let's start from the beginning.
Equality for justice has never been given. Never.
Why are we still fighting for this?
The most fulfilling thing in a woman's life is to have a baby.
ERA has nothing to do with abortion.
Standing up for the ERA that took so much grit.
Division of responsibility between the provider and the homemaker.
ERA! When do we want it? Now!
The Equal Rights Amendment is short and to the point.
The proposed constitutional amendment, passed overwhelmingly by the Senate and the House, holds that, quote,
equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex.
That doesn't sound particularly subversive.
That's it. It's one sentence.
Section 2.
Congress shall have the right to legislate, to enforce this.
Section 3. This amendment shall take effect 2 years after the date of ratification.
In 1923, suffragist Alice Paul introduced the ERA to Congress. That's right, nearly 100 years ago.
When Alice Paul first introduced the ERA, it received some opposition from moderate women's groups, and the women's movement, which had united in support of the 19th Amendment, split. Social justice feminists, the labor-oriented women that advocated for not just equality of the sexes, but racial equality, now stood in opposition to equal rights feminists, who were singularly focused on securing full legal equality for women. This split hindered the ERA's progress in the decades following its initial introduction. When women of color spoke about classism or racism within the movement, white women often dismissed their concerns. On the other hand, many men and some women's groups were worried that the Equal Rights Amendment would eliminate protective legislation. These so-called protective laws were meant to protect women from the hazards of paid work. In actuality, they restricted women's access to economic freedom and to the workplace. For these reasons and more, the ERA faced a lot of opposition when it was first introduced. But a small group of dedicated women from the National Women's Party kept it alive in Washington, D.C. They introduced the bill to Congress every year, but for a long time, it didn't go anywhere. The ERA received a hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee in 1938 after members of the Business and Professional Women's Club of Arizona organized a campaign to pressure the chairman, Arizona Senator Henry Ashert, to consider the bill. That's as far as it got that year. Interestingly, the Republican Party first endorsed the ERA in 1940. The Democrats announced their support in 1944. The ERA was passed out of committee and was voted on in Congress for the first time on July 19, 1946. Early on, there was a lot of debate about whether or not the Equal Rights Amendment should include an exemption for protective legislation. Women like Alice Paul decided that protective legislation was very limiting and it was the ERA in full or nothing. Some proponents of the ERA thought that including an exemption for protective legislation might make it easier to pass, especially in a time when Congress was overwhelmingly male. That route seemed like it might be more successful. Senator Carl Hayden definitely thought that it was better to include an exemption. Senator Hayden attached an amendment which provided an exemption for protective legislation. That amendment was called the Hayden Rider, and it was almost successful. Alice Paul described Senator Hayden as someone that was very sympathetic to the cause of women, and when he introduced this, he had no idea that it was going to almost get the ERA through Congress in 1950. The problem was, Alice Paul and a lot of the ERA supporters didn't want the Hayden Rider to be attached to the Equal Rights Amendment. They wanted to get rid of protective legislation, and the Hayden Rider was going to exempt all of those laws. Alice Paul would later describe the Hayden Rider as a thorn in their flesh. Opponents of the ERA realized that the Hayden Rider was dividing ERA supporters, and so they kept attaching it to the Equal Rights Amendment year after year from 1950 onwards. It turned out to be a really successful strategy for opponents of the ERA. Later, in the 1960s and 70s, women's issues resurfaced. As more and more white women entered the workforce, protective legislation became less and less popular. A lot of groups that had supported protective laws in the past now saw how they were restricting women and limiting their economic freedoms. So they switched over to support the women's movement and the Equal Rights Amendment. While before women's groups had disagreed on the ERA, now moderate, liberal, and radical feminists united in support of the amendment. In 1966, the National Organization of Women, or NOW, was founded, and it proved to be instrumental in the eventual passage of the ERA.
NOW was formed in 1966, and the focus was on consciousness-raising groups and the whole idea that we had to raise the consciousness of women to understand that they were being oppressed, that they were not free in the way that the structure was at this particular time. So there was a lot of focus on self-awareness.
The amendment passed Congress in 1972.
It finally got approved by Congress. But in order to become law, 3/4 of the 50 states must ratify constitutional amendments by their state legislatures.
As soon as the ERA passed Congress, activists and elected officials across the country sprung into action.
Hawaii ratified it within 23 minutes of it passing Congress.
ERA supporters in Arizona immediately got to work trying to get it through the state legislature.
The first big champions for the ERA were then State Senator Sandra Day O'Connor and State Representative Sister Claire Dunn. And it's very important to note that Sandra Day O'Connor is a Republican and Sister Claire Dunn was a Catholic nun. And they were both huge pioneers and champions of women's rights here in Arizona. Both of them shattered the glass ceiling to be able to get to where they were. Sandra Day O'Connor went on to do it with the Supreme Court, and Sister Claire Dunn unfortunately lost her life not long after she began this fight for the ERA in our state House of Representatives.
But as the women's movement grew in the early 1970s, so did its opposition. A strategic, relentless, and well-funded campaign began against the amendment. It was called Stop ERA, and it was led by right-wing activist Phyllis Schlafly.
Well, I'm not really sure how Phyllis Schlafly became the spokesperson, but she did. It was a political opposition based on power structures from the very beginning. The arguments that they used back then are many of the same arguments they're still using today with some tweaks.
Equal rights. If women had them, it would destroy the family. Yeah, it would. That men and women would be forced to use the same bathrooms. That women would be forced to serve in the military. Oh my gosh.
It will take away from women some of the most important rights and benefits and exemptions we now have.
It would not only require women to be subject to the draft, but it would relieve fathers of their primary duty for the support of minor children, and it would place millions of divorce support decrees presently in existence in jeopardy.
And that women would get abortions and gays would get married. Yeah, folks, that ship has sailed. And that has nothing to do with the Equal Rights Amendment.
The biggest obstacle to passing the ERA is overcoming falsehoods that it will open the floodgates for abortion.
One of their big arguments back then and today is abortion, 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 and abortion. And our response to that is fairly simple. Abortion is already a constitutional right under Roe v. Wade. I do not need to pass the Equal Rights Amendment in order to have abortion be a constitutional right. Since 1972, you have been fighting it. We have been trying to save it. We're on a crash course right now with the cases that are at the Supreme Court. You know it, we know it, everybody's fighting about it, and that's what's going to continue.
You know, abortions are already legal. That's already happened. And the fight will go on for decades, probably.
That decision was based on privacy, not equality. It was a different constitutional principle, and it has nothing to do with the Equal Rights Amendment. It has to do with Roe v. Wade and the constitutionality of abortion.
So if someone came up to you and said, well, we have the 14th Amendment, so why do we need the ERA?
Well, a very quick and simple answer is this. If the 14th Amendment gave women equality, Why did we need the 19th Amendment to vote? I mean, for one thing, we know Antonin Scalia said the 14th Amendment does not grant women equal rights.
Certainly, the Constitution does not require sexual discrimination on the basis of sex. The only issue is whether it prohibits it. It doesn't. Nobody ever thought that that's what it meant. Nobody ever voted for that.
Not that we haven't come almost as far as we would with the ERA by the court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment. But still, if you are trying to decide cases the way the framers would have decided them, if you asked anyone who was in Congress at the time the 14th Amendment was sent to the state, does this mean that women will be citizens of equal stature to men? The answer would be, of course not.
The reason it hasn't given us equality under the law, under the Constitution, is because of the manner in which courts analyze the discrimination cases. There are 3 levels of analysis when a case gets to the court. The lowest level of analysis is called rational relation. The highest level of scrutiny is called strict scrutiny. In 1967, because all of the agitation for women's rights and all of that, the court created an intermediate scrutiny only for women. So it began the movement towards saying you can't make laws based on stereotypes of what you think a woman is, what you think a mother is, what you think a worker is, what you think a secretary is. You know, you can't make laws based on these things. You gotta look at facts, and you have to make sure that your law actually achieves the goal that you set out to achieve. Then women embarked upon a process of trying to get strict scrutiny. We got ourselves moved up from rational relation to the intermediate. Now we're trying to move up to strict scrutiny. Some people say, well, you know, you already have all the rights. You already have equal pay laws. You already have non-discrimination laws. Yes, we do. And they work to a certain extent. But they don't give you constitutional equality.
It seems to me my attitude about equal rights is that this is a democracy. And in theory, all people should be participating members of the democracy. Now, in recent years, it has become you cannot discriminate against people because of the color of their skin. It seems to me we should also say you cannot discriminate against people because of their sex, and to me that is the essence of ERA and why it should be passed.
Okay, you don't agree with what she's... You don't disagree with her, do you?
Well, it all depends on what you mean by discriminate.
You have considerable support in your effort to stop the ERA.
Oh, yes, we've gotten 17 state legislatures to reject the Equal Rights Amendment.
And 38 required.
Right.
In order to become part of the Constitution, it needed 3/4 of the states to ratify it. By 1982, it had 35. But the Stop ERA activists, coupled with a fierce anti-abortion movement, had halted its progress. In 1980, the Republican Party withdrew its endorsement of the ERA.
With pressure from Phyllis Schlafly, the Koch brothers, and Ronald Reagan. They took it out in 1980. That's where you really start to get the partisan divide. It's not a partisan issue. The Republican leadership has tried to make it a partisan issue so that their followers will just lockstep follow, but it's not.
The pathways towards full legal equality were now unclear, and they were riddled with obstacles. Women turned towards their individual careers and their personal lives and tried to attain the same kind of economic standing and equality and power of their male counterparts. And eventually, most people operated under the assumption that we already had an Equal Rights Amendment, that the Constitution already guaranteed legal equality for women.
80% of Americans think it passed in the 80s, and it did not.
And as time went on, and the ERA wasn't making the news anymore, and most people forgot what it was, there were still a small number of dedicated individuals that kept it alive. Across the country, and especially in states where the ERA hadn't been ratified, there were dedicated legislators that introduced the bill even after the deadline in hopes that it would be ratified in their state.
After the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass in 1982, women got very dispirited.
It seemed like the amendment was dead. History books and women's studies texts have proclaimed it a failure.
But then came 2016.
Many say that the election of Donald Trump sparked a fire.
So now we see how far we've come and how far we still have to go.
Women in the Arizona State House and the State Senate have introduced the Equal Rights Amendment every year in the hopes that it will get a hearing or it will gain a little more traction. But so far, we've yet to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment.
Arizona had always been quite high in the numbers of women who were in the legislature up until 2016 when Nevada went over us. And Nevada now has more than 50% women in their legislature. And once they went over that 50% mark, bingo, they passed the ERA, just like that.
Nevada was the first state in decades to ratify the ERA. Then Illinois followed suit. In 2019, Democrats in Virginia took control of the state government for the first time since 1993.
Virginia is officially blue. Congratulations.
With majorities in both chambers of the General Assembly, all eyes turned towards Virginia. The ERA was a top priority for the 2020 legislative session, and, as expected, it sailed through both houses. On January 27, 2020, Virginia ratified the ERA, making it the 38th state to do so.
We have the 38th state, that means 3/4 of the state legislatures have ratified, but you still can't be sure this is going to be a part of the Constitution.
Once 3/4 of the states have ratified a constitutional amendment, it goes to the Archivist of the United States, who certifies that the amendment is indeed now part of the Constitution. The National Archives and Records Administration released a statement saying that they're deferring to the Office of Legal Counsel and the Department of Justice. Because DOJ and the Office of Legal Counsel have said that the ERA is not at present under consideration by the states, the archivist has refused to certify the ERA.
Is it too late for the Equal Rights Amendment to become law?
The Office of Legal Counsel says it's simply too late for the ERA.
States that ratified the ERA decades ago have since rescinded those votes.
We have word that there will certainly be court challenges. Whether or not it holds it up or not is the question.
This is why the fight for the ERA has now moved to the courts. Before Virginia even became the 38th state to ratify the ERA, many different groups and states and attorneys general were already filing lawsuits related to the amendment. The attorneys general from the 3 most recent states to ratify the ERA have filed a lawsuit against the archivist to force him to add the ERA to the Constitution. The states of Alabama, Louisiana, and South Dakota have filed a lawsuit opposing the ERA. These issues will almost certainly have to be decided by the Supreme Court. And the arguments they'll have to consider are mainly, 1, whether the 1982 deadline set by Congress is actually valid, and 2, whether states can actually rescind ratification of a constitutional amendment. To say that legal experts disagree on the ERA would be an understatement. Supporters generally think that there are 2 pathways moving forward. One of them is to pursue these lawsuits and to battle it out in the courts. This is a part of their ongoing 3-state strategy. So Virginia, Nevada, and Illinois became those remaining 3 states that they needed, and they're going to argue now that those 3 states count and that the ERA should be certified as part of the Constitution. The second route that supporters could pursue, especially amidst all this uncertainty, is to start over. Starting over would mean passing the Equal Rights Amendment through both chambers of Congress once again, and then trying to get the required 38 states to ratify it once more.
Well, I would like to see a new beginning. I'd like it to start over. There's too much controversy about latecomers, Virginia, long after the deadline passed. Plus, a number of states have withdrawn their ratification. So if you count a latecomer on the plus side, how can you disregard states that said, we've changed our minds?
Generally speaking, ERA supporters seem to be pursuing both of these strategies. The ERA has been introduced into Congress every year since 1923. I think that will continue until the ERA becomes part of the Constitution. And it looks like these 3 states that are a part of the 3-state strategy, they're not going to give up. So what can you do to help out the ERA? In terms of the 3-state strategy, you can urge your United States Senator who represents you in Washington, D.C., to vote on a bill to remove the deadline placed on the ERA.
So the deadline has been this big hurdle, but really the idea is that Congress put the deadline in, they extended it once, and now they can eliminate it. So today the House voted and extended that deadline, eliminated that hurdle, and now we can move forward, get that passed in the Senate, and get the ERA into the Constitution once and for all.
Please call, email, write a letter to your United States Senator and ask them to support this bill to remove the deadline on the ERA. Even here in Arizona, there are things you can do. You can ask your representatives in the state legislature to consider ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment. Some ERA supporters often mention a sort of third strategy, which is the 50-state strategy. If nothing else, ratifying the ERA in all 50 state legislatures would show immense support for the amendment and maybe force politicians to reconsider their stance on it. Today we're seeing a resurgence in myths and controversies surrounding the amendment, and it's really hard to break through that noise. What we need the most is to raise awareness about what the ERA would actually do and what it really stands for.
Women are not paid what they're deserved. They're not treated the way that they're deserved. The Me Too movement is evidence of how far we have to go. We've come a long way, but we got a lot more work to do. And the ERA will make that happen. So don't be distracted by these head fakes. Don't worry about those. I got about 20% of my caucus, Republicans, pro-life, every one of them, to vote for this. And I'm proud of that. This is a bipartisan effort. This isn't about partisanship.
If we do this, this goes down in the history books. Arizona goes down in the history books.
Exactly. She's right about that. Arizona could go down in the history books, and let's be honest here, that just doesn't happen much.
We're literally one vote away from getting equal rights under the Constitution.
So I have 3 granddaughters. I would like to be able to take out my pocket Constitution and say that the equal citizenship stature of men and women is a fundamental tenet of our society.
This was my grandmother's fight. I don't want my daughter to have to keep fighting this fight for equal rights. It's time.
It's been almost 100 years since the Equal Rights Amendment was originally introduced to Congress. Why are we still fighting for this?